Blitzkrieg, the aptly named Lightning War. Nazi leader Adolf Hitler and his generals knew that Germany could ill afford another static war of attrition, like that fought in the trenches of the Great War. And so together, they devised a bold and aggressive new style of warfare, one that emphasized speed and close coordination of each of the branches of the German Wehrmacht. However, Hitler, who wanted to maintain his authority over much of the campaigns in Czechoslovakia, Poland, Scandinavia and Western Europe, found it difficult to stay up to date with events as they unfolded on the battlefield from the capital of Berlin. Thus, with his sights set on what he viewed as his greatest military endeavour yet, the invasion of the Soviet Union, he decided to establish a new, secure military command post as far east as possible, in order to keep him close to the action as he guided Germany towards what he saw as their destiny. Forever remembered as the Wolf's Lair, this complex with its reinforced concrete walls, heavy security force, natural obstacles and elaborate camouflage scheme became the most well-protected command post in the world between 1941 and 1944. And yet it was here that the Fuhrer would find himself closest to death from hands other than his own. With Hitler having spent 850 days at the Wolf's Lair during the war, more than anywhere else within the Third Reich, in this episode we are going to examine the history of its creation and its use by the man who dreamed of leading his army across all of Europe, Asia and the world. Welcome to Wars of the World. Before we get into the rest of the video, I'd like to thank World of Warships for being today's sponsor and helping to support the channel. World of Warships is a thrilling, free-to-play, tactical, team-based shooter video game. They have over 650 historically accurate ships which you can play, with stunning visuals and changing weather conditions that impact the gameplay. They bring out new content every month, with the focus in June being the incredible collaboration of D-Day that turned the tide of the war. The Allied naval forces were pivotal in bringing about the ultimate victory in World War II. You can commemorate these heroes by playing special missions to remember and honor their sacrifice and bravery. To get started today, use the link in the description to enjoy a massive starter pack worth €25, which will give you a boost in the special D-Day PvE and PvP missions. Find your brothers in arms, or join a group of friends to form an invincible division with destroyers, submarines and much more. Thanks again to World of Warships for sponsoring today's video. It was from a cell in Landsberg prison following his failed coup in 1923 that Hitler worked on the book that would come to define the Nationalist Socialist movement in Germany. Mein Kampf, meaning my struggle. Mixed in with his political observations, conspiracy theories, ideas of eugenics, and discussions on the sport of boxing, he outlined the future as he saw it for Germany under the banner of the Nazis. Detached from German society, he envisioned the rise of a new German empire from the ashes of defeat in the Great War, one even more powerful than that overseen by the Kaisers of old, that would expand beyond its own borders across Europe and eventually across the globe. And he would be at the head of it all, immortalized as the builder of this new superpower. The new territories would, as he saw them, serve to fuel and feed the new fatherland, with the following passage from his book reading, quote, "If new territories were to be acquired in Europe, it must have been mainly at Russia's cost, and once again the new German Empire would have set out on its march along the same road as was formerly trodden by the Teutonic Knights, this time to acquire soil for the German plough, by means of the German sword, and thus provide the nation with its daily bread." End quote. This left none of his followers in any doubt that war with the Soviet Union lay in the future of Germany, once he had come to power and set in motion the wheels of the destiny he had promised upon them. This, coupled with his utter disdain for communism, meant that many Nazis found it difficult to fathom that the late 1930s would see a period of clandestine cooperation between Hitler and the Soviets under Joseph Stalin, particularly on military matters, as a way of Germany bypassing the restrictions of the Treaty of Versailles. This culminated in the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a treaty of non-aggression between the two powers, signed in August 1939, which carved up Eastern Europe into two sectors, where each signatory could exert their influence without interference from the other. While it flew in the face of Hitler's ideology, it was a shrewd political move on the part of the Fuhrer, allowing him to continue his expansion in preparation for his inevitable clash with Moscow without invoking Stalin's ire before he was ready. Just over a week and a half later, having already conquered Czechoslovakia, Hitler decided the time was right to invade Poland. While he had secured his eastern flank for now, his invasion had of course invited the wrath of the Western powers of Britain and France, who declared war on Germany on September 3rd, 1939. This development distracted Hitler from looking east throughout the remainder of 1939 and well into the summer of 1940, by which time he had added Belgium, Denmark, Holland, France, Luxembourg and Norway to his conquests, while Britain was on the ropes, with Hermann Göring, the head of the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, promising him his pilots would force London to surrender within days. This caused Hitler to take his eye off Britain and start entertaining ideas for his next phase of the war, the invasion of the Soviet Union. Thus far, his enemies had proven inferior in either tactics or equipment, but while he viewed the Soviet Red Army as being equally inferior in individual performance compared to his own Wehrmacht, he was forced to accept that they held a significant advantage in numbers, and he would be fighting on a significantly broader front than any thus far. He also recognized that speed was again going to be the key to success in order to prevent the Soviets from fully mobilizing against his invasion force. And so, in order to reduce the time information took to feed back to him, and for his orders to be relayed to the front line, Hitler decided he needed a command bunker as close to the front as possible. He therefore instructed Dr. Fritz Tutt, a construction engineer who in March 1940 had been appointed the Reich's Minister for Armaments and Ammunition, to begin scouting for a location for such a bunker, as close as possible to the border Nazi Germany now shared with the Soviet Union, following the conquest of Poland. Tutt and his entourage began an exhaustive search of various locations before settling on a piece of forest near the town of Rastenburg, in the northeast of Poland, just 50 miles from the Soviet border. This spot was not just randomly selected by Tutt. The area offered numerous advantages as a site for what was to become the most important headquarters in the Nazis' war effort. For one thing, the area was sparsely populated, with little in the way of targets of interest that might attract enemy aircraft, which could stumble across the bunker. The dense forestation also made it easier to conceal access roads and even the planned fortifications themselves. If the bunker was to be discovered, then aiding in its protection would be the Masurian Lake system, an accompanying marshland that sat between it and the border and created a natural obstacle for an approaching ground force. While situated nearby was the Bojan Fortress and a former Polish army barracks which could house a large protection force. Rastenburg itself also possessed ideal road and rail links and even a small airfield that had been built in 1935 which could be expanded upon to meet the Luftwaffe's needs. In short, it was as if the spot was tailor-made for the Führer's needs, and on November 15th, 1940, Hitler authorized construction to begin and demanded that it be completed by April the following year. Secrecy was of course of paramount importance to the whole effort, as Stalin was still laboring under the belief that Hitler would abide by their pact, and was himself distracted by his war with Finland, which wasn't going as well as he had hoped. This despite reports from his western frontier of German reconnaissance aircraft penetrating Soviet airspace, and over the coming months, a noticeable increase in German and pro-Axis troops in occupied Poland. To provide a smokescreen for the building of a bunker near Rastenburg, a cover story was created, whereby the site was being developed as a chemical works. This front allowed Tutt to order materials from German contractors, who would remain oblivious as to what their products were really being used to build, limiting the possibility of Soviet or British spies catching on to the project and then alerting Stalin. Even then, there were clues as to what was really being built. The Hoyer Company in Hamburg, for example, found themselves contracted to manufacture giant monolithic reinforced concrete slabs that were designed to connect together into one exceedingly tough structure. Primary responsibility for the construction of the site fell to two companies, Weiss und Freytag and Dickerhoff und Wittmann, both of whom had extensive experience in building fortified structures for the German government. They oversaw an army of over 2,000 workers drafted from Todt's labor movement, who wore green ex-Czech army overalls to identify themselves to the German troops assigned to guard the area. And yet, despite these efforts to safeguard the work, Todt had overlooked one thing that threatened to blow the lid on the whole project. In this period of official cooperation between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, the Soviet state airline Aeroflot flew a route between Moscow and Berlin that passed over the region. However, in an ironic twist, these flights being allowed to proceed unobstructed actually fueled the smokescreen that the Germans were laying that they were building a chemical works, since the Soviets reasoned that Hitler would never let the flights continue if it were anything more. Thus it was the case that Soviet airline pilots frequently looked down, oblivious to the construction of the bunker, from which so much misery would be directed against their people in the coming months. Unfortunately for Todt, the plans for the many bunkers, connecting tunnels, and roads and protective perimeter all proved too complex to meet the Fuhrer's April 1941 deadline. And in fact, it would only be completed on the very eve of Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941. By then, the Wolf's Lair, as it had become known thanks to Hitler's penchant for liking himself to a wolf, had evolved into an intricate and sprawling complex, hidden away in the forest thanks to an elaborate camouflage scheme designed to make the immense concrete bunkers blend into the surrounding woodland when viewed from an aircraft. The Fuhrer arrived for the first time at the Wolf's Lair on June 24th, just 48 hours into the invasion, unaware that he would spend more of his remaining days there than anywhere else within the breadth of the empire, which he had forged in fire and blood. Upon entering the facility, Hitler must have felt reassured of his safety there, given the depth of the security arrangements. The 617-acre site contained 3 distinct security zones, each well defended against an attacking ground force. The outermost security zone, or Sperrkreis, was naturally the hard outer shell of the facility, it consisting of high barbed wire steel fence and a minefield, and guarded by members of the Führer Begleitbrigade, or FBB, a special armored security unit of the German Wehrmacht, who controlled the entry and exit of all persons both in and out of each zone. The middle security zone housed the living quarters of several of Hitler's Reich ministers, whose roles required them to be close to the Führer as he directed the invasion of the Soviet Union. This included Todt's own quarters until he was accidentally killed on February 8, 1942, when his plane crashed shortly after takeoff from Rastenburg Airport. After the incident, he was replaced as armaments minister by Albert Speer. Also housed in this middle zone were the barracks for the SS Reichssicherheitsdienst, or RSD, who were directly responsible for providing protection for these high-ranking party officials. The quarters for much of the lower-level support staff working at the Wolf's Lair was also located in this zone. While figures vary according to their source and the point in the war in which they were quoted, at least 2,000 people worked at the Wolf's Lair on a typical day. However, at times that figure swelled to over twice that number during times of strategic crisis. Finally, there was the innermost zone and the very heart of the Wolf's Lair. Again, this zone was protected by another perimeter of heavy steel fencing and guarded by the RSD. Within this zone, which would have the primary responsibility for safeguarding Hitler, security was managed by the SS Begleitkommando des Führers, or FKB, which operated under the command of Obersturmbannführer Bruno Gescher. While he generally trusted his soldiers, nevertheless, these were the only armed guards Hitler allowed to be close to him. They had undergone the strictest vetting to confirm their loyalty. They never had to surrender their weapons and were never searched, unlike the RSD, who were always required to remain at positions some distance away from Hitler. It was here that the Führer bunker and 10 other camouflage bunkers built from 2 meters or 6 feet and 7-inch thick steel-reinforced concrete were located. These shelters protected members of Hitler's inner circle, such as Martin Bormann, Hitler's much-loathed private security, and Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring, from all but the heaviest of Allied bombs. Hitler's accommodation was on the northern side of the Fuhrer bunker, so as to avoid direct sunlight, which could otherwise raise the temperature inside to an uncomfortable level, and also featured a conference room for him to hold meetings with his staff. Having finally moved into the Lair, Hitler set about the task of directing Barbarossa, and in those early days, the news from the east was good. German troops, along with a number of anti-Soviet allies, such as Finland, Romania, Hungary, and his longtime Italian allies, were steamrolling across the western regions of the Soviet Union, the Red Army proving almost totally inept when confronting the now highly experienced and motivated Wehrmacht. This was what Hitler had dreamt of when he was dictating Mein Kampf, back from his cell in Landsberg prison. He led an army from a command post that was set to slay the Soviet bear. A typical day for Hitler would begin with breakfast, followed by a walk alone with his beloved dog Blondie at 1000 hours, after which he would look at the latest mail that had been delivered to him by air from Berlin. After that came the day's meetings around midday concerning the war before a comparatively late lunch at 1400 hours, after which he assigned a couple of hours to non-military matters concerning the running of the Third Reich, something that seldom interested him. After a short coffee break, a second meeting was usually held concerning the situation on the front, followed by dinner at 1930 hours, after which there was a period of relaxation and socializing for both him and his inner circle. The Wolf's Lair had its own cinema, which Hitler frequented regularly, or he would have music played on a gramophone, the selection being typically German, with the likes of Beethoven or Wagner. While the Wolf's Lair enjoyed many of the amenities of civilization for Hitler, it was seldom comfortable, being rather cold in the winter and equally hot in the summer. The latter state being made all the more unbearable by swarms of mosquitoes from the surrounding swampland that the German exterminators could never eliminate. Being invited to dine with Hitler offered his staff the chance to have the Führer's ear for an hour or two, to voice their opinions in private if the moment presented itself. But for the typically red-blooded Germans, this often meant that they had to put up with the vegetarian meals, as the Führer didn't believe in eating meat. Later in the war, servants or even guests also found themselves being asked to taste an increasingly paranoid Hitler's food for poison. Hitler's obsession with conquering Russia quickly became problematic for others engaged elsewhere in the Third Reich, particularly with Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who was still contending with British Empire forces in North Africa. It wasn't that the Wolf's Lair couldn't allow Hitler to oversee events on other fronts. It did, after all, enjoy excellent communication links thanks to the main railway line that ran through the region, and the nearby airport where the Luftwaffe kept a fleet of transportation aircraft on standby. But rather, it was that Hitler's mind appeared to become largely fixated on the task of conquering Russia whenever he was staying at the Wolf's Lair. That was its purpose, and that was why he was there. Thus, when you consider that according to Albert Speer, the Führer spent only 57 days away from Rastenburg in the period between mid-July 1941 and March 1942, the frustration other commanders on other theatres must have started to feel becomes all the more clearer. As if this were not enough of a headache for the German military leadership, the Wolf's Lair had another previously unforeseen setback to their campaign in the east. The intention had always been to improve the efficiency of the German leadership directing the battle, but being so close to the front allowed Hitler to start micromanaging Barbarossa when the situation on the Eastern Front began to change following the winter of 1941 and 42. He frequently altered plans or overruled his field commanders on a whim, leading to moments of confusion on the front line, and he would often redirect fighting units, especially the vital panzers, far from their previous positions, significantly reducing their availability to fend off the increasing numbers of Soviet tanks that were appearing as the Eastern Front finished its first year of war. By the summer of 1942, Hitler had started to grasp the seriousness of the situation which he had led Germany into, now also including the United States, after Hitler declared war upon them in support of Japan in December 1941, much against the advice of almost his entire inner circle. Consequently, he began to fixate on his own safety, even at his well-protected eastern bunker. while Hitler was confident he was safe against Polish resistance fighters or an Allied commando unit attempting to penetrate the Lair. The growing strength that the British Royal Air Force was demonstrating against Germany with their new, powerful 4-engine bombers, and of course who were now being joined by the mighty US Army's air forces, began to convince Hitler that the Allies would attempt to assassinate him with an airstrike while he was residing in the Wolf's Lair. Göring tried to reassure him that such a raid was impractical, given that only the longest-ranged Allied bombers stood a chance of even reaching Rastenburg from Britain, and that they would face intense opposition from the Luftwaffe's fighters all the way across Western and Central Europe. Göring also pointed out that they weren't even sure that the Western Allies knew of the Wolf's Lair's location, and even if they did, they would have to use exceptionally heavy bombs to penetrate its reinforced ceilings and walls. But despite these reassurances, Hitler was unconvinced. Göring and his Luftwaffe had failed him at Dunkirk, they had failed him at the Battle of Britain, and they were failing him now on the Eastern Front. He therefore ordered that the Wolf's Lair be given even greater protection, particularly from the air. In this instance, Göring was right about everything except for one detail. The Western Allies had gathered from intercepting German communications both to and from the bunker, its approximate location. But they deemed a raid too high risk for the very reasons which Göring had highlighted to Hitler. As for the Soviet Air Force, while they had less distance to fly to Rastenburg, they lacked strategic aircraft suitable for such a raid, its bombers instead being tailored for supporting the Red Army. Nevertheless, from 1942 onwards, Hitler always looked up at the sky over the forest, picturing swarms of Allied bombers flying overhead, all of them trying to kill him. However, it was the situation on the ground that was the real threat. By 1943, the Wehrmacht had completely lost their window of opportunity to decisively defeat the Red Army, which was now not only mobilized with literally millions more men than the Axis forces, but was enjoying greater technological powers thanks to the delivery of American and British aircraft and tanks that allowed them to replace their obsolete types, while Soviet factories that had relocated eastward began churning out their own modern equipment. While the Germans still generally enjoyed a qualitative edge, the Battle of Kursk in July 1943 proved the old Soviet adage that quantity had a quality all of its own. And from then on, the Germans were left in retreat in the face of superior Soviet numbers. Consequently, the protection afforded the Wolf's Lair was made even stronger, and Hitler's bunker was given its own security zone. Upon arriving back with Hitler in mid-1944, one of his secretaries, Traudl Junge, described the Wolf's Lair as being unrecognizable compared to her previous visit. However, quite famously, the real threat to Hitler's life came not from an approaching army, but from within his own ranks. On July 20th, 1944, a group of Hitler's own men, led by Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, tried to assassinate him at the Wolf's Lair by smuggling in a bomb and placing it under a table. It was this table that would ultimately save Hitler's life, as it shielded him from the blast, and von Stauffenberg and his fellow conspirators were arrested and executed, as were a number of others viewed as a threat to the Fuhrer, including the Desert Fox, Erwin Rommel, who felt his Afrika Korps had been betrayed by Hitler and his obsession with Russia. Understandably, the July 20th plot further wrecked Hitler's nerves and heightened his sense of unease, even in the Wolf's Lair at this stage of the war. Traudl Junge would later state that between August and November 1944, air raid warnings sounded almost daily as Soviet reconnaissance aircraft, now operating from airfields in range of the Rastenburg forest, roamed the area looking for targets. Hitler was convinced that after each of these flights, bombers would follow to try to kill him. In reality, the site was so well camouflaged that the Soviet pilots rarely had an inkling as to what they were flying over, or were even still laboring under the belief that any buildings they saw were the remains of a chemical factory. On September 14th, 1944, the Red Army began its Baltic offensive, which aimed to liberate Estonia and Lithuania from German control and strike into northern Poland. Hitler remained at the Wolf's Lair, directing the counteroffensive for 2 months, but the situation proved hopeless. The Germans and their remaining Axis allies in the east were fighting against the inevitable, and so on November 20th, 1944, he was forced to leave Rastenburg for the last time in order to relocate to his Fuhrer bunker, beneath Berlin, where he would spend the remaining days of the war and his life. He left orders to the SS to begin destroying all traces of the Wolf's Lair, but it was so well constructed that they were unable to complete the task. On January 27, 1945, a formation of Soviet troops arrived in the forest, the last German guards now having abandoned their posts. The Soviet troops expected to encounter fortified German army positions established by the retreating Wehrmacht to try and stall them. With the site being so well camouflaged, it took them several hours to realize that they had captured Hitler's eastern bunker, probably the most fortified command center of the entire war, all without having fired a single shot.